Sometimes you meet someone, and it just feels right. The connection is real. The love is mutual. There's a stillness beneath the beauty, like your soul finally stopped running. But if you've lived enough, loved enough, lost enough, then even in the presence of that love, a quiet question rises. Not out of fear, but out of experience. Is this the beginning of something that stays, or is this love here for something else? Because some meetings feel too precise to be random, as if the universe timed them with exactness, as if the world stepped aside for one moment to let two paths converge, so that something buried could finally rise to the surface. Carl Jung spent his life exploring what most people ignore, the hidden architecture of the soul. He didn't believe the unconscious was just a passive storage of memory. He saw it as alive, a psychic field with pattern, regulation, and meaning. And he believed the universe was not separate from this field, but both a mirror of it and a lens through which its deeper truths come into view. In his words, the psyche is a self-regulating system, constantly working to bring us back into wholeness, even when it must use rupture to do so. Sometimes this self-correction happens through dreams, symbols, or illness, and sometimes it arrives in human form, a person, a presence, a sudden connection that shifts the coordinates of your life without explanation. Jung called these moments synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence of inner and outer events that are not causally connected but have deep significance. In these moments, the universe doesn't explain, it arranges. And when someone enters your life at the exact moment your soul is ready for change, and then disappears, but leaves the deepest part of you awakened, Jung would say it wasn't a loss. It was a message. But how do you tell? How do you know whether the love that found you was meant to build a life or to break a pattern? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll know the 7 profound truths that reveal the difference between a love meant to endure or one destined to awaken something you were never meant to forget. And if that kind of knowing speaks to something sacred in you, subscribe. Let's begin. The soul doesn't measure love in time. We begin here, because this is where most people get confused. If love shakes the soul, shouldn't it last forever? Is there a minimum duration required for it to be real? But the truth is simpler and more sacred. Not every love that transforms you is meant to stay, and not every ending is a failure. Some of the most important souls you'll ever meet arrive without warning, speak a language only your nervous system remembers, and vanish before your mind understands what just happened. You don't get years. You don't get labels. Sometimes you only get a moment. But that moment tears a hole through your old life, and nothing fits the same after that. You walk differently. You speak with more stillness. You begin asking questions you never had the courage to ask before they appeared. And you realize it wasn't how long they stayed. It was what they stirred. In that realization, a deeper truth emerges, one of love's most sacred and difficult lessons. We are only passages in one another's becoming. Even soul-level love, especially soul-level love, does not always arrive to remain. It arrives to awaken. When two souls meet in that sacred space, not to perform a role, not to fulfill a tradition, but to embody a connection written beyond this lifetime, their time together cannot be measured in months or milestones. Whether it lasted a week, a season, or a year, it was real, the journey was yours, and its very impermanence is what made it holy. Not in how long it lasted, but in how free it was, how deep, how alive. This is how the universe orchestrates these encounters. Carl Jung told us, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Not attached, not claimed, transformed. You could have known them for a few hours. You could have crossed paths in a city neither of you lived in. But the moment you met, time collapsed, and for a brief second you weren't living your story. You were remembering something older than memory. You understand the rule now, even without naming it, something in you recognized it. It's when the depth of connection far outweighs the length, when meaning outlives time. It's not about duration, it's about destiny. They didn't stay long, but they changed everything, and that alone was sacred. If these kinds of truths speak to something inside you you've never quite named, subscribe. This isn't just content, it's remembrance. But when this kind of love arrives, love that feels this ancient, this awake, how will you meet it? Will you bring your soul, or just your mask? The self cannot love through a mask. This is where many stories begin to bend, taking us to a deeper place. In many relationships, we don't enter as ourselves. We enter as our persona. Carl Jung defined the persona as the part of the psyche we create to adapt to social life. It's the mask we wear to appear acceptable, to others and often to ourselves. Jung wrote, "The persona is a functional complex that comes into existence for reasons of adaptation or personal convenience. It is a segment of the collective psyche, which is given to the individual in order to enable him to make a fitting impression upon others and to conceal the true nature of the individual." In love, the persona can be seductive. It makes things smoother, it buys time, it gives the illusion of compatibility, but it does so at a cost. It hides the truth of the self. You might notice it happening like this. You don't say what you actually think. You smile when you're anxious. You nod instead of objecting. Your voice softens, your edges round out. You stop doing small things you love, because they might seem strange. You shape your energy to match theirs. You call it love, but it's survival. And Jung warned us, this mask cannot last. The unconscious will not sustain an arrangement that denies the self. The psyche is not interested in harmony for its own sake. It is interested in wholeness. And when a relationship depends on your mask, the mask eventually shatters. And what breaks next is the illusion. What's left behind is either a hard lesson or a chance to begin again with more honesty. Love that begins with persona cannot deepen. It survives only through control, performance, and projection. And eventually someone either leaves or disappears inside the performance. But there is another way. Not easier, not louder, but real. When you enter a relationship without the mask, with your full range of thoughts, instincts, values, contradictions, then love begins not as a performance but as a mirror. There is no shape-shifting, no shrinking, no pretending to be more soft or more clever than you are. And when the other person stays, not despite this, but because of it, you begin to see the shape of something that can hold truth. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Because when love begins with a mask, it doesn't deepen, it performs. It may feel intimate, but it's not connection. It's choreography. And when two people fall for each other while still wearing the mask, it isn't a relationship. It's a masquerade. But if the mask shatters and they're still there, are they truly loving you? Or have they just awakened a part of you that no longer knows how to hide?" The pain didn't come from harm, it came from depth. This one is often misunderstood because the pain doesn't arrive when they leave. It begins while they're still here, and that's what makes it sacred. You weren't being hurt, you weren't being betrayed, and yet, something in you ached. After they held you, you cried, but couldn't explain why. After laughter, silence would drop like a veil, and your chest would tighten. You feared their absence more than you should, not because they had done something wrong, but because they had touched something old, something you buried so long ago, you forgot it was still alive. Carl Jung believed that the unconscious is not passive. It does not wait politely for us to grow ready. It intrudes, especially through relationships that carry archetypal weight. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And when a soul-level connection enters your life, it doesn't just bring comfort, it brings confrontation, not with them, but with yourself. You remember things, moments you thought were finished, the way your mother left the room in silence, the way your father held affection just out of reach, the moment someone crossed a boundary you didn't know how to name or how to stop. They didn't do this to you, but their presence became the doorway through which the ache returned. It's confusing because everything seems fine, but your body tells a different story. You feel unsteady after intimacy. You over-apologize. You anticipate loss, even when no one is leaving. And beneath it all, there is this phrase echoing quietly inside you, "Please don't leave me like they did." This is not neediness. This is affective memory surfacing through proximity. The psyche is reaching into the past, not to punish you, but to retrieve something sacred. They didn't break you. They stirred the part of you that had never been given permission to break. Now, standing in front of someone who truly sees you, something primal rises. Not because they are dangerous, but because they are symbolic. A mirror your soul had been preparing for, and that's why it hurts. This is not the pain of betrayal. This is the pain of return. Not to them, to you. But if the ache was this deep, was it truly about them? Or was your soul remembering someone it never truly met? The image broke before the bond did. There are some endings that don't come with silence or betrayal. They arrive gently, like waking up from a long, beautiful dream. At first, everything felt holy, fated, as if the universe had parted its veil just enough for two souls to find each other in the right lifetime. The recognition was instant, the connection magnetic. You were sure it was them, and in many ways it was, but not in the way you thought. Carl Jung warned us, in the earliest stages of love, we rarely see the other person as they are. We see a projection, a soul image cast from our own unconscious. He called these figures the anima and animus, the archetypal inner feminine and masculine. And when someone in the outer world carries the symbolic weight of that image, we fall, not for their reality, but for our own psychic echo reflected on their face. Jung wrote, "The anima and animus produce a state of illusion that is always present in love affairs. It's not deception, it's myth, the myth of completion, the myth of recognition. But what feels like completion is often just reflection of what we long to find or feared to face. That's why the image often breaks before the bond does. Not because the person changed, but because your psyche stopped projecting. The spell lifted. You began to see their fear, their silence, their small cruelties and unspoken absences, and you didn't fall out of love. You fell out of illusion. What remains after projection fades is either a deeper meeting or a quiet exit, because sometimes what you were loving wasn't them. It was your own unlived story, dancing behind their eyes. And when that story completes, so does the relationship. Jung once said, "We always see our own unavowed mistakes in our opponent. It is the projection of our shadow." And when projection dissolves, clarity arrives, not always gently, but always cleanly. So if the image fell away, and the love didn't survive the truth beneath it, then maybe they weren't sent to complete your dream. Maybe they were sent to free you from it. But what if the interruption wasn't an accident, but a doorway? If you recognize yourself in these patterns, or someone who cracked them wide open, subscribe. This journey isn't about answers, it's about mirrors. They didn't come to build a life, they came to break a pattern. Some people don't enter to walk beside you, they arrive to stand in your way. At first it feels like fate, like the universe gave you a gift too precise to question, but something else begins to unfold, quietly, then completely. Not a merging, but a dismantling. You start forgetting who you were before them, not because they completed you, but because the structure of your old self begins to collapse. This is not chaos, this is individuation. Carl Jung described individuation as the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating the forgotten, the repressed, the unlived parts of your soul into a single center of gravity. But here's the part most people miss. Individuation almost always begins with disruption. The life you built around your false self has to break, for the real self to emerge. And often, the universe sends someone to do just that. They don't arrive with warnings, they don't speak in therapeutic language, they just appear. And suddenly your reactions change, your tolerance breaks, your path no longer fits, you say things you've never said, you remember a version of yourself you didn't know was still alive. It's not about them being good or bad, it's about what they awaken. Because your meeting wasn't just emotional, it was structural. Your soul was living a pattern, often one you inherited, one that served your survival. But survival is not wholeness. And love, in this form, becomes the sacred detonator. Jung wrote, "The most intense conflicts, if overcome, leave behind a sense of security and calm. It is just these intense conflicts which are needed to produce valuable and lasting results." That's what this was. A necessary conflict, a psychic combustion. They didn't complete your story. They burned the part that was never yours to carry. And in the aftermath, you may have mistaken their departure for abandonment. But it wasn't rejection, it was release. Because the pattern was no longer unconscious. The illusion had been seen, the cycle had broken, They weren't your future. They were your turning point. But what if love doesn't awaken pain, but peace? There was nothing to control and nowhere to hide. Some connections don't ignite fireworks or destroy illusions. They dissolve defenses. There's no chase, no performance. Just a stillness you didn't know your nervous system could hold. You're not trying to impress, explain, or prove anything. And strangely, they aren't either. It's not because they've solved you, but because they don't need to. Carl Jung warned us that much of what we call love is often ego in disguise, a performance of connection, a management of perception. We shapeshift to stay lovable, project to stay safe, and control to feel secure. But none of that is presence. It's choreography. And in rare relationships, that choreography stops. You don't monitor your voice. You don't rehearse your sentences. You don't shrink your instincts or edit your depth. And what's even more astonishing, they don't punish you for it. No emotional audits, no psychic surveillance, no you're too much or you should know better. Just space, spaciousness. And in that space, something ancient returns, rest. This is not laziness. It is not comfort without weight. It is the arrival of the self. Jung called the self the regulating center of the psyche, the archetype of wholeness. And in the presence of someone who does not demand your fragmentation, the self can finally surface. Not as a role, but as presence. Not as drama, but as clarity. He once wrote, "Where wisdom reigns, there is no conflict between thinking and feeling." That's how you know, not because everything is perfect, but because nothing requires hiding. The ego relaxes. The mask slips. The war ends, not because you've won, but because you no longer need to fight. They didn't complete you. They made control unnecessary, and that is one of the rarest forms of love. If that kind of peace feels like home to a part of you that never had one, subscribe. You're not the only one walking this path. But if they weren't sent to fix you, or even break you, then what were they here to reveal? What if they weren't here to change you at all, but to mirror who you already were? They didn't come to save you. They came to reflect your power. Some people don't offer help. They offer reflection. They don't try to fix you. They don't give you tools, language, or answers. And yet something about their presence reawakens a force you forgot was yours. You find yourself speaking differently, standing more fully, remembering things you thought you had buried, not because they pulled you forward, but because their gaze held no doubt that you belonged there. Carl Jung believed that the self, the true center of psychic life, doesn't emerge through willpower or performance, but through mirror, through confrontation, through sacred recognition. And in certain soul-level encounters, that recognition doesn't arrive in words. It arrives in silence, in presence, in being seen without being edited. At first, you may have mistaken it for admiration. You thought, they believe in me more than I do. But that wasn't it. It wasn't belief. It was memory. They didn't empower you. They revealed your power, the part you had exiled beneath performance, silence, trauma, and perfection, the part that had been waiting not for rescue, but for reflection. They were the cathedral, not the altar, the mirror, not the guide. And in their eyes, your wholeness returned. This is not a fantasy. It is not romantic inflation. It is what Jung called the symbolic life, when outer events reflect inner readiness. And this is the final truth. They weren't sent to save you. They were sent to remind you, you no longer need saving. They didn't stay to hold your hand. They passed through, just long enough for you to hold your own. Not because they were perfect, but because for one moment they were clear enough to reflect what was already yours. So now the question is no longer about them. It's about what you'll do with what they left behind. So now we arrive, not at the ending of a love story, but at the doorway of your becoming. You've walked through 7 quiet rules the universe often reveals when it sends a love that feels sacred, but might not stay. And maybe, somewhere along the way, you saw yourself. Was it love, or was it a profound awakening? Did they offer you peace, or did they return you to the fire you were born to walk through? Did they complete you, or collapse the version of you that was never truly complete to begin with? Perhaps they weren't meant to stay. Perhaps they weren't meant to build a life with you. But they were meant to hold the mirror, long enough for you to see the part of yourself you once forgot, the part that does not beg, the part that does not vanish when others leave, And now it's no longer about them. It's about what you do with what they gave you, or rather, what they reminded you was already yours. So let this be the quiet truth. They didn't leave you behind. They left you ahead, further than you'd ever been, because they didn't take your power, they revealed it. And now, the rest is yours, not in their shadow, but in your light. If something stayed with you, write it below. A sentence, a memory, a line you'll carry. You never know who might be waiting to read exactly what you just remembered. And if this stirred something quiet and sacred in you, subscribe. Not for distraction, for depth. We walk this path together. Until the next one, take care.